It's news we first broke here on Law and Crime. 12,000 new accusers have come forward in the case against P. Diddy. That's literally thousands of new allegations pointing the finger at the now disgraced singer, accusing him of coordinating a decades-long sex trafficking scheme. More than 100 civil suits based on these allegations are soon to be headed his way, but Diddy isn't the only one mentioned. Other high-profile names will allegedly be listed in these lawsuits, and before some of these suits are filed and made public, these celebs are reportedly settling outside of court. There's a lot to unpack here, and we'll do it all with civil trial attorney David Ring. Last week, Houston-based attorney Tony Buzbee made a major announcement. His firm is expected to file 120 civil lawsuits over the next 30 days. And the main defendant? P. Diddy. Last month, the 54-year-old, whose legal name is Sean Combs, was taken into custody in New York after he was indicted by a grand jury. He's now facing federal charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Diddy's arrest came nearly 6 months after federal investigators raided 2 of his homes in both Los Angeles and Miami. We now know the feds collected guns, ammunition, electronic evidence, and more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant when they executed those search warrants. Federal prosecutors now believe they have a major case against Diddy that could lead to some serious jail time, all thanks to the evidence collected there, including apparently incriminating digital evidence showing something called freak-offs. The federal indictment against Diddy mentions this evidence and also defines freak-offs, saying they were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, masturbated during, and often electronically recorded. But the federal indictment isn't the first time we heard the phrase freak-off or got word that some of his illegal activity may have been recorded. Last November, Diddy's ex, Cassandra Ventura, filed civil suit against him, alleging years of abuse, all at the hands of Diddy. And Cassie's lawsuit also introduced us to the now infamous term freak-off. She says it started when Mr. Combs hired a man and brought the man to his home in Los Angeles. The man, Mr. Combs, and Miss Ventura wore masquerade masks and ingested drugs. Mr. Combs directed Miss Ventura to perform sexual acts with this man while Mr. Combs watched them. He allegedly masturbated while he directed Ms. Ventura and the man to do specific sexual acts. Mr. Combs began to call the arrangement a freak-off, or FO. He would repeatedly tell Ms. Ventura at random moments that he wanted an FO, and Ms. Ventura was eventually expected to facilitate the location and the hiring of male sex workers. Diddy's lawsuit was settled outside of court just 1 day after it was filed, but the damage to Diddy's image had already been done. Her lawsuit paved the way for at least a dozen more civil suits to be filed against the now disgraced singer, all citing the same terrifying pattern, that Diddy would allegedly drug these victims or force them to drink alcohol that was oftentimes laced. After that, he would sexually assault them or force them to have sex with a prostitute or both. During all this, Diddy often recorded the entire incident and would later use it as blackmail to keep these victims quiet. But it's now these alleged recordings that have become Diddy's undoing in terms of both federal and civil cases. So the recordings are referenced in the indictment against him, but they're also referenced in multiple of Diddy's civil suits. He's listed as a defendant in a dozen suits right now, but that number is about to be bumped to the triple digits over the next month, when 120 new suits are expected to be filed. The attorney behind these lawsuits, Tony Buzbee, says 60 of the survivors filing suit are women and the other 60 are men. Of them, 25 allege they were sexually assaulted as minors. More than half of these survivors already spoke out about the abuse, reporting it to police or hospitals. As Buzbee explains, this is not a class action lawsuit, but rather each survivor will file suit against Diddy separately in the state where their incident occurred. Buzbee says the assaults took place in Los Angeles, Miami, and New York, and they date as far back as 1991. He says these lawsuits will describe multiple new allegations, including violent sexual assault or rape, sexual abuse, facilitating sex with controlled substances, false imprisonment, compelling prostitution, sexual misconduct, dissemination of video recordings, and sexual abuse of minors. Buzbee held a press conference about these lawsuits on Wednesday. I spoke with him on Thursday, and he told me a staggering number of additional survivors came forward after that presser.
We've had 12,000 calls since, I guess, in about 24 hours. And so our Herculean task is to try to sift through every one of these calls and make sure that we are identifying those who are victims and those who are witnesses and collect evidence. I mean, we have about almost 100 people working on this task. We have 120 cases that we are preparing to file, and we're trying to sift through another 12,000 phone calls and contacts that we've received in the last 24 hours.
You heard that right. 12,000 people came forward in the span of 24 hours. They allege abuse at the hands of Diddy, but some accusers mention other names too. Busby says they're high-profile names that will shock us, meaning some A-list celebrities also allegedly have been involved in these freak-offs. There's also reports that at least one of these major celebs can be seen in an incriminating video taken at a freak-off. So we don't know these names for sure yet, but we could soon, as Busby says he plans to name drop in the coming suits. But there may be a few exceptions. There are some reports that one or multiple of these A-listers is working to settle these lawsuits before they're filed. And if that's the case, we may never know their names at all. There's a lot to unpack here, so it's time to bring in civil trial attorney David Ring. I just wanted to start with this news about the new 120 lawsuits that are set to be filed over the next 30 days. I mean, in the past, we had a dozen civil suits against Diddy, but now more than 100. So what's your reaction there with all these dozens of lawsuits headed his way?
The floodgates have opened. You know, here we go. And what's going to happen is, you know, you have this lawyer out of Texas who's rounding up a lot of new claimants. And we'll see how many actually get filed, but he said that he's got 120 cases, and he says it also includes minors, you know, people who were under the age of 18 when something sexual misconduct occurred between Diddy and the victim. So it's going to be very interesting to see how many of these lawsuits get filed, what the allegations are against Diddy, and again, the other thing that's going to be interesting is they're going to be filed in different jurisdictions. You know, it's not like, this is not a class action. This is not just one lawsuit getting filed. That's not how it works. This is going to be apparently 120 or so individual lawsuits scattered across the country, although it sounds like most of them originated in New York. So there's going to be a lot of interesting allegations that come forward in the next few weeks or months when these cases are filed.
As you said, 120 new suits all across the nation, mostly in New York, but still, that's quite a bit of paperwork to say the least. But then if we're talking about numbers, 12,000 is the next one that jumps out, because the attorney, I actually spoke with him last week. He said after news of this was published that these 120 civil suits were going to be filed, that 12,000 more people came forward to his firm and said that they had been violated by Diddy. Those numbers are just startling to me. What do you make of the thousands who reported?
It's going to be very interesting to see what comes of that. I mean, that's an eye-opening number. That's a number that is difficult at first glance to believe. There's 12,000 people out there that claim that some sort of sexual misconduct occurred to them from one person. And so it wasn't clear to me if he received 12,000 calls about something, or if these were really all legitimate types of cases or people calling. So again, I don't know. Let's take that with a grain of salt, maybe, the 12,000 people calling. But what he did say for sure is, you know, he has signed up over 100 people and obviously has got a lot more calls to go. So we could be looking at several hundred cases when all is said and done.
It's interesting that you point out that number 12,000, because as I was doing the interview, I heard him say 12,000 and I thought, oh, my mind must be auto-correcting. He means 1,200. I'm hearing and then I went back and listened to it and was like, wait, no, he actually said 12,000. So it will be interesting to see. But if that's the case, anyway, we know that we have more than 100 people. How do they go about determining whether a civil case could be filed? Are they corroborating the information, proving that they actually were with Diddy, things like that?
I think it's incredibly important for these civil cases to have corroborative information and corroborative evidence. I mean, that's important in every case, especially a sexual assault case. And the other important thing is the credibility of the victim. look, there's going to be some very, very, very credible victims that come forward with legitimate cases. But you also have to realize in something like this, there's going to be some people that come forward who are not so credible. You know, they're trying to hop on the gravy train after it's already gone down the litigation route. And so, you know, for any attorney handling any of these cases, it is incredibly important to to vet the claimant, to vet the client, to make sure it's a legitimate case, that they can back it up. Because the worst thing that can happen is, these cases get filed and the victim is immediately shown to be untruthful or a liar, or it didn't happen. And that really hurts all of the legitimate victims' cases. And so I think these lawyers are going to have they're a tough time, not a tough time, but they're going to have to spend a lot of time really vetting these cases to ensure that there's legitimate victims, that there's corroborative evidence, that the dates match up, that the events took place when they say they took place. And that's true of every case, but really true here.
Besides the sheer number of cases that are expected to be filed, a lot of people are talking about that, but we're also talking about the major names that could be listed in these lawsuits. So this attorney has come forward and said, these names are going to shock you. A lot of them are A-list or celebrity, and there will be allegations against them. So there's also been reports that whoever these people may be are worried, retaining attorneys. What do you think is going through their minds if they know they were with Diddy at potentially one of these freak-offs?
Boy, if you're a celebrity at one of these freak-offs, the last thing you want is your name to come out in the media as being a willing participant. And so, yes, I'm sure there are a lot of high-profile people out there right now who are very concerned about what comes next, especially given apparently the evidence that a lot of these events, these freak-offs, were filmed. That there's video out there. That you have a former security person saying he filmed all sorts of things for Diddy, including these freak-offs, and now that can come back to haunt a lot of people. So I think there's a lot of worried people out there, and sure, if you're a high-profile person and you don't want to be associated with this, I guess one thing you could do would be to try to cut it off at the pass and try to reach some sort of resolution, some sort of settlement before a case ever gets filed. Now, there's a lot of pros and cons to that approach, because you might be dealing with one attorney on one case, but what about victim number two with a different attorney who decides to sue you? I mean, you're gonna go around settling all these cases with different attorneys before they ever come to fruition. So again, it's going to be very interesting who gets drawn into this Diddy net of salacious, horrible freak-offs and allegations against him. And Hollywood's worried. The music industry's worried. Executives are worried, no doubt about it.
Going off what you were saying before, there have been some reports that one of these celebrities, or multiple, again, we don't know who or how many, but at least one has apparently settled before any of these suits could be filed, so that their name would not be listed in these lawsuits. I mean, you kind of pointed it out there, but wouldn't that be a daunting task if there are 120 lawsuits and they may be involved in all of them? What would that even look like?
A very daunting task. And so, and look, assuming that's true, that someone has come forward and settled the case, we're never going to know, right? They've settled it. It's confidential. We're never going to know who that person is, what amount they paid, what their role was. It just, it's just out there, right? And so, but I think if you are a celebrity and you're at one of these freak-offs or you somehow were involved in this, it's a very daunting task to go out there and try to kind of plug the dike on all the potential cases out there. And so I think it's also an interesting strategy by this lawyer, and what he's doing is smart. He's floating this out there, and he's got this, his 800 phone number up there, and he's generating interest for lawyers to call him for that exact reason, to say, hey, I want to try to resolve this case with you before you ever file it. And so it's a smart strategy, and it sounds like maybe it's working with these other Hollywood figures that might get drawn into the fray.
So, if let's say one of these celebrities has reached out and settled with the plaintiff before the suit could be filed, obviously we, the public, wouldn't know their names. But is it possible that investigators would reach out to the person who was potentially going to be this plaintiff and say, hey, what are your allegations? Do you have video? In an effort to potentially prosecute this celebrity?
Yeah, it's a possibility. I mean, I think the federal government has directed all of their efforts, obviously, at Diddy at this point in time. I will say this too: is that generally speaking, the law in most of the states is if you observe a crime, you don't necessarily have any legal duty to report the crime. Now, there's exceptions to that, but just generally speaking, the law is if you observe a crime and you don't report it, there's nothing you did wrong. I mean, morally, sure, you should have reported it. Legally, you don't have to report a crime if you don't want to. So let's just assume one of these celebrities are there and they witness something, potentially illegal. They don't have any obligation to report it. They can't be prosecuted for that. Now, look, one huge exception to that in every state is if someone witnesses a child being abused, you have an obligation to report that, particularly if you're a mandated reporter of child abuse, meaning you're someone who deals with children all the time. Then you can be prosecuted for not reporting. That applies to teachers and coaches and people who deal with children all the time. So to circle back to your question, I think it'd be a very, very difficult criminal case against some other person who was at a freak off who just happened to be there and observed something illegal.
But you did touch on something really important, these allegations of child sex abuse. And that's what we're hearing from this attorney, Tony Busby, that multiple people were assaulted before they were age 18, someone as young as 9, others were 14 or 15. And in the federal indictment, it's interesting, none of this is mentioned, nothing to do with the age of the person. There's actually only one victim listed, but nothing to do with child sexual assault. So do you think it's possible then that prosecutors could add those charges against Diddy if it's corroborated with these civil suits?
Absolutely. I mean, here's while the criminal case and these civil cases are really going to start dovetailing into each other because they're going to feed off each other. And so you have the criminal case that was filed, and now the prosecutors in the criminal case have the advantage of seeing all these allegations that are coming forth in these civil lawsuits, and particularly the ones involving minors. And so you can bet that they're going to reach out to the attorney in Texas or to the actual victims themselves if they knew who they are, and see if those claims are legitimate. And if they are, you can bet that those criminal allegations will be added to the criminal case against Diddy. And boy, that's going to be devastating if the authorities add allegations and criminal charges involving abuse of minors, sexual abuse of minors. I mean, that's so you're going to see these cases they're not going to merge, but the information certainly is going to be shared back and forth, and you're going to see the criminal case probably blossom into a bigger case than what it started out to be.
One of the main things about these freak-offs is that a lot of them were recorded. So people have video or photo evidence allegedly of all this, and this is what prosecutors are saying too. But also I'm wondering about witness testimony. These accusers, do you think it's possible, you said authorities may be speaking with them about the investigation, but do you think that prosecutors would talk to them and maybe even put them on the stand weeks down the line?
Well, look, the criminal case is going to rest upon people or victims who are at these freak-offs, because you know what the prosecutors are going to have to prove is that people or the victims were unwilling participants in what took place there. And for example, if they can find a witness who says, yeah, the alcohol at these freak-offs was spiked with drugs, and obviously no one knew that, and it was done to render people either slightly unconscious or just to make them so that they were compliant, that's a huge witness. And they're going to want to find those witnesses to say that took place and that Diddy knew it was taking place. That was part of the game plan. If there was witnesses who are going to say that he used, illicit drugs to gain compliance of victims, or that he physically abused them to gain compliance at these free-offs. Incredibly important witnesses, because that's how the prosecution is going to prove their case, through witnesses like that who are going to disprove. Look, Diddy's going to come in. If he has to put up a defense, his defense has to be, this was all consensual. Everyone knew what they were getting into. Everyone knew what these parties were about. Everyone knew it was kind of, unfortunately, this giant orgy, and they knew what they were getting into, and it was all willing and voluntary stuff. So these witnesses who could, no, it wasn't voluntary. They're having their drinks spiked. They were being physically challenged and physically abused to do this. And so that's where these witnesses are going to be so important.
Talking about the witnesses too, it kind of gets my brain thinking about these potential celebrities or A-listers who are going to be listed in these lawsuits. I know you said it may be difficult to prosecute them, or prosecutors aren't even going to focus their energy on them and more keep it on Diddy. But I'm wondering if they would maybe use the testimony of these celebrities to their advantage. So you have the people who were allegedly assaulted by Diddy, but what about these other people who may have been in the room, may have been participating, but they flipped, so to speak, to testify against Diddy?
Again, a definite possibility. The more credible witnesses the government can gather for this case, the better the chance they have of gaining a successful conviction against Diddy. And so, sure, if they're able to obtain the testimony of a celebrity who was there, who says, hey, I saw this happening, and in hindsight, it was illegal, or it didn't seem to be consensual, that's huge testimony. That's going to crush Diddy's case. And the problem's going to be, are you going to be able to get a celebrity to come forward and say that? Are they going to willingly say that they saw something that they now perceive to be illegal, and then publicly come forward and make themselves known and be part of that? That's gonna be a tough one for the prosecution, for the government.
Do you think there's anything else big I didn't ask you about this case, the specifics, anything?
No, I think the other thing I would add is, you have all these lawsuits coming down the road. What's going to happen though is the criminal case definitely takes priority. Okay. And so you could see all these lawsuits being filed, and what happens then is the courts put a hold on them all. They put a stay on them all, because in the civil lawsuits, Diddy can't be forced to testify. He has a Fifth Amendment right. And so you could see all of these lawsuits filed and come to an abrupt halt. And then they'll have to wait out the criminal case. And then when the criminal case is finally over, okay, now the civil cases can proceed. So you could be looking at kind of a Harvey Weinstein situation. I mean, it's been 7 years since Harvey Weinstein, all these allegations first started. We're still dealing with Harvey Weinstein, right? I mean, another criminal case in New York, and through all of that, one conviction, bunch of civil lawsuits, many of them still pending. And so I think we have a long way to go with this Diddy scenario.
Following news of these 120 civil lawsuits, Diddy's team released a new statement saying, quote, as Mr. Combs' legal team has emphasized, he cannot address every meritless allegation in what has become a reckless media circus. That said, Mr. Combs emphatically and categorically denies false and defamatory any claim that he sexually abused anyone, including minors. Diddy has pleaded not guilty to the federal charges, saying he plans to tell his side of the story when it comes time for trial. Ahead of that, he's due back in court on Thursday, and we'll be there to bring you all the latest.